Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Always ready to dig into some data.
Today we're focusing on Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd.
An Indian company. They specialize in stainless steel pipes and tubes.
We're taking a close look at their Q2 FY25 financial results.
We've got quite a bit of material to work with.
We do a press release, their unaudited financials, a very sleek investor presentation, and we've even got some insightful questions to help guide our analysis.
Should make for an interesting deep dive.
Definitely. So let's make sure all of our listeners are on the same page here. Our mission today is to really break down where this company stands, how they're performing, and get a sense of what their future might look like. I think we can do that.
I think so. Let's go for it.
All right, let's kick things off with a question that's right at the heart of our source material. What were the key highlights from Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd's Q2 FY25 financial results?
Well, if we look at the press release and investor presentation, they both emphasize pretty impressive revenue growth. We're talking 19.6% year-on-year for Q2.
Okay, that's pretty substantial growth. But is that just for Q2?
Nope, it gets even better. For the first half of FY25, they reported a solid 26.4% growth.
Wow, okay, so that really paints a picture of a company that's on an upward trajectory. But what I'm curious about is how does this growth compare to the rest of the market? Are they just riding a wave, or are they really outperforming the competition?
That's the key question, isn't it? And to answer that, we need some context.
Well, the investor presentation does give it some clues. It actually highlights that their volume growth for both seamless and welded pipes exceeded 30% in the first half of FY25. And get this, their market share for seamless pipes, it went from a measly 1.6% in FY20 all the way to a pretty considerable 8% in FY24.
Now, that's what I call grabbing market share. Definitely not just riding the wave, they're making moves.
Exactly. And before we get too lost in the numbers, I want to point out something that really caught my eye. Did you see the part about Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd? Boasting over 70 Fortune 500 companies in India as clients?
Oh yeah, that stood out to me too. That's a pretty big deal.
It is. It speaks to their reputation, the quality of their products. I mean, to be meeting the demands of such major players, that's got to give them some serious credibility.
For sure. And it's not just domestic success either. Remember, their exports are up a staggering 2.5 times year on year.
That's right. And that makes me wonder, what's fueling that kind of international demand?
It's likely a combination of factors. We're talking global infrastructure development, the ongoing energy transition, and I think there's a growing recognition of the quality coming out of Indian manufacturing these days.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But hold on a sec. Before we get too carried away with all the good news, our source material also raises some questions about market demand and supply chain factors. Did they run into any obstacles this quarter?
Actually, yeah, the press release mentions that domestic sales took a bit of a hit from those heavy rains in certain regions.
Right. And that actually led to some orders being pushed into the next quarter.
It did. A little reminder that even companies performing well can be vulnerable to these kinds of regional events.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how crucial supply chain resilience really is in today's world.
Couldn't agree more. Oh, and speaking of future demand, their order book is sitting at a record high, about 340 crore rupees.
Okay, now that is a big number. What does that tell us?
Well, to me, that's a pretty strong indicator of future demand and the company's own confidence in their outlook. Sounds like they've got a lot of business lined up.
So all signs pointing towards continued growth.
So far, yes. But remember, revenue's just one side of the coin. We need to look at profitability, too.
Good point. How do they do on that front?
The press release and investor presentation both highlight healthy EBITDA and PAT margins, which suggests they're operating efficiently and their financial strategies sound.
That's good to hear. And when we look closer at the profit and loss account, there's one thing that really jumps out there: gross profit margin.
Oh, yeah, that's impressive. It's up by a significant 550 basis points for Q2.
Oh, and a whopping 770 basis points for the entire first half of the year.
For those not familiar with all the financial jargon, that basically means for every 100 rupees of revenue, Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd is pocketing a bigger chunk of profit after they cover their production costs.
So they're managing costs well. Or maybe they have strong pricing power in the market.
Could be both, really. A good mix of smart management and favorable market conditions.
Makes sense. But I can't help but think back to those increased freight costs we talked about earlier. Surely those must be putting some pressure on their export margins.
Absolutely. That's a constant balancing act for any company operating globally. Capitalize on the international demand, but also navigate those tricky international shipping costs.
It's a tough game. Now, while we're on the topic of strategic moves, I noticed they've been busy on the hiring front. They brought in a new chief strategy officer and a VP of business development. What do you make of that?
Oh, talent acquisition is always a good sign,
Yeah.
especially in a specialized industry like this. I see it as a commitment to growth and maybe even a hint that they're looking to shake things up a bit.
It does make you wonder what's next. One of the questions from our source material actually asks about what steps the company is taking to, mitigate any risks they're seeing in these financial results. It sounds like they're not just sitting back, they're actively planning for the future.
Absolutely. Strengthening the leadership team is a smart move, especially with those ambitious expansion plans they've got.
Ah, yes, those expansion plans. I was hoping we'd get to those. Fill us in.
Well, the investor presentation lays out some pretty interesting initiatives. We're talking a foray into fittings and value-added welded tubes.
Okay, so they're not just growing, they're branching out into new product lines.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. This is their growth strategy in action.
We're talking potential impact on revenue, on margins, and how they position themselves within the market. But are these calculated risks, or are they maybe stepping into uncharted territory? What do you think?
Good questions. Let's start by breaking down these plans.
All right, let's tackle the fittings venture first. What's the thinking behind that move?
If you look at the investor presentation, they're aiming to offer what they call complete PFF solutions. That stands for piping, fittings, and flanges. Basically, they want to be a one-stop shop for their clients.
Makes sense. Why not leverage their existing relationships, their expertise, and offer a wider range of products? It's a classic way to expand and capture more of that market. And hey, didn't I see something about them planning to use their internal waste and scrap as raw material for the fittings?
You did. That's a smart move on a couple of levels. From a cost perspective, it's brilliant, and it also ticks the sustainability box.
Resource optimization, efficiency, that can be a real competitive edge these days.
Right. And they're not just doing this blindly. The investor presentation points out that the fittings market has relatively low competition, so they might be able to establish a strong foothold pretty quickly.
Oh, so they're strategically targeting areas where they can really make an impact. Smart.
Very strategic. Now, what about those value-added welded tubes? What makes them so special?
From what I gather, we're talking stainless steel and titanium welded tubes. These are designed for some pretty high-demand applications.
We're talking high precision, resistance to corrosion, and we're talking sectors like food processing, pharmaceuticals, even nuclear and power. Definitely moving up the value chain here.
Higher margin products, niche markets, sounds ambitious. But can they pull it off? Do they have the expertise, the technology, and the infrastructure to deliver?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? But the investor presentation seems pretty confident. They're highlighting their state-of-the-art infrastructure, their rigorous quality control, and a management team with a proven track record. Plus, they've installed an acid regeneration plant, which signals a focus on sustainability and efficiency.
And let's not forget those new hires we mentioned. They're assembling a team that seems ready to lead these new ventures.
It's all coming together, isn't it? Now, remember that question from our source material about management's projections for the next quarter and their strategies for sustained growth?
Right, right. I'm trying to recall if they gave any specific projections.
No hard numbers in the sources we have, but I think their actions are speaking pretty loudly.
Yeah, they're investing, they're diversifying, they're bringing in new talent. That definitely sends a message.
It does. But every ambitious plan has its risks. What potential challenges do you see for Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd.?
Well, the obvious one is competition. Even if they're entering segments with relatively low competition right now, that could change quickly. Staying ahead of the curve, adapting to new customer needs, maintaining that technological edge, those are going to be crucial.
Absolutely. And let's not forget those global economic uncertainties that are making headlines. Currency fluctuations, geopolitical tensions, those pesky freight costs. They can all throw a wrench in the works, especially for a company that's quite reliant on exports.
That's a good point. One of our questions actually specifically asks about the impact of foreign exchange rates and those global economic conditions. Did the investor presentation address that at all?
They do acknowledge those risks, but they also emphasize their strong financial health. Healthy cash flow generation, manageable debt levels. Sounds like they feel pretty confident in weathering any potential storms.
That's good to hear. Which brings us to the next area I wanted to explore, Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd's overall financial health. What does it all mean for potential investors?
Now we're getting to the heart of the matter. This is where we go beyond those headlines and really dig into those financial statements. We're talking balance sheet, cash flow statements, the stuff that helps us understand their financial stability.
So where do we start?
Let's look at their balance sheet. That's always a good place to start. The investor presentation gives us a glimpse. And what's interesting is that their total assets have jumped significantly, from about 758 crore rupees in March 2024 to over 944 crore rupees in September 2024.
It's a pretty big jump in just 6 months.
It is, and that increase in assets is likely tied to their capacity expansion and investments in those new product lines. They're putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
So that's a good thing, right? More assets means they're growing.
Not necessarily. It depends. We need to see what those assets are made of.
Okay, what should we be looking for?
Well, are those assets mainly tied up in property, plant, and equipment? Or do they have a healthy balance of current assets, things like cash and receivables?
Right, so a closer look shows a big chunk is tied up in property, plant, and equipment, which makes sense given those capacity expansions, but they also have a decent amount of current assets, including a jump in inventories, probably getting ready for those new product launches, and their cash and cash equivalents have gone up too, although from a pretty low starting point.
Now let's shift our focus to the cash flow statement. That's where we can see how efficiently they're generating cash from their operations. That's vital for growth, for managing debt, and weathering any economic downturns.
So how's their cash flow looking?
Well, the cash flow statement shows they generated around 25 crore rupees in cash from operations in the first half of FY25.
Okay, and is that good?
That's a positive sign. It means they're converting their profits into actual cash, which gives them more flexibility and resilience.
So they're not just profitable on paper, they're actually generating cash.
Exactly. Now, what about their debt levels? Remember that question we had?
Right. We need to see how much debt they're carrying.
Their balance sheet suggests their debt seems manageable, but to get a clearer picture of their financial leverage, we need to look at their debt-to-equity ratio.
And what is that ratio looking like?
If my calculations are right, their debt-to-equity ratio sits around 0.1, which is pretty low. It suggests they're not overly reliant on debt financing, which is generally a good sign for investors.
So painting a picture of financial health here. A solid asset base, generating cash from operations, and not burdened by a ton of debt. But of course, as always, past performance doesn't guarantee future results.
Exactly, and that's the thing that's on every investor's mind, right? What does all this mean for someone thinking about investing in Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd? What are the key takeaways? It's a question that needs a bit more context to answer properly. On the one hand, they have a lot going for them. Strong financial performance, a dominant position in a growing market, and they've got a clear strategy for expansion, all arrows pointing upwards.
Definitely checking a lot of boxes. But there's always another side to the story, right? What are the potential downsides investors need to be aware of?
Well, no investment comes without risk. That's right. No investment comes without risk. And with Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd, I'd say execution is key. It's one thing to have those big plans, but scaling up production, maintaining quality, keeping those costs in check, that's a challenge.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of those shiny new products and expanded factories, but if they can't actually deliver, well, that's a problem.
Great, and the investor presentation did mention some past issues with their supply chain, something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely something for potential investors to consider.
And then you've got the unknowns that come with any new venture. Even with experienced leadership, there are no guarantees.
And let's not forget those global factors we talked about adds another layer of uncertainty, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Currency swings, political instability, trade policy changes, those can hit export-dependent companies pretty hard. And then there's always the wild card of interest rates. If those spike servicing debt becomes a lot more expensive, which can really throw a wrench in those growth plans.
So even though the investor presentation acknowledges these risks, it's ultimately up to each individual investor to weigh them carefully, right?
Absolutely. Investors need to consider their own risk tolerance and how this company fits into their overall investment goals. But their current financials look pretty solid, which has to be reassuring, right?
Yeah, manageable debt, positive cash flow, that's a good foundation. But you mentioned earlier that those things can change pretty quickly as they invest heavily in these new ventures.
Right. Past performance is never a guarantee of future success. Things can change rapidly in business, and investors need to be prepared for that.
So for someone seriously considering investing in Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd, what's the key takeaway here?
I'd say due diligence is essential. Don't just rely on those highlights and the glossy investor presentation. Really dive into their financials, understand the industry they're operating in, and see if their strategy aligns with your own investment horizon and risk appetite.
So it's not just about the numbers themselves. It's about understanding the story behind those numbers and then figuring out if that story matches your own investment philosophy.
Precisely. We've given you the pieces of the puzzle here. Now it's up to you to put them together and decide if Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd is the right fit for you. Is it a high growth, high reward opportunity, or are the risks too much for your comfort level? That's the question every potential investor needs to answer for themselves.
This deep dive has been packed with information. We've gone from dissecting financial statements to talking about global forces that are shaping an entire industry, and all through the lens of this one company.
What I find fascinating is how Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd's story really reflects some of the larger trends we see happening in the business world. The push for sustainability, the complexities of global trade, the constant need to innovate. It's a microcosm of the challenges and opportunities companies face in today's ever-changing environment.
It really is. So as we wrap up, I want to challenge our listeners to go beyond just the information we've shared here. Do your own research. Look into their competitors, track those industry trends, and see how Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd measures up over time. Will they become a dominant force in their sector, or will they get overtaken by the next big thing? Only time will tell.
But by staying curious and informed, you'll be better equipped to navigate those complexities of the investment world and make decisions that align with your own financial goals.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to your own deep dive into the world of Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd. But don't go anywhere just yet. Stay tuned, because up next, we're tackling a whole new set of fascinating facts and figures. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd, we've uncovered a lot.
Yeah.
But I think the real value comes from, connecting the dots, figuring out what it all means for our listeners.
I agree. We've gone from those big picture highlights all the way down to the nitty-gritty of their financials, their expansion plans, even those potential risks they face. It's a lot to digest.
It really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it back to our listener and that big question. Should they consider investing in Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd?
The million-dollar question. Well, as we've discussed, there's no easy answer. It all comes down to individual circumstances, risk tolerance, investment goals. But I think we can offer some key takeaways to help our listeners make a more informed decision.
Okay, let's do that. What's the first thing our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd. They're a company on the move. They've shown impressive financial performance, they're aggressively pursuing those growth opportunities, and they seem to have a solid plan in place. Those are all good signs.
Definitely. But we've also talked about some potential downsides.
Right. And I think those boil down to three main areas: execution, competition, and those external factors that are kind of out of their control.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. What do we mean by execution risk?
Well, those expansion plans are ambitious. Moving into those new product lines, scaling up production, managing costs effectively, that's not easy. And remember, we saw they've had some supply chain issues in the past. So for investors, the question is, can the company execute on these plans flawlessly?
Right. And what about competition? How does that play into it?
Even though they seem to be going after segments with relatively low competition right now, things change fast. New players could emerge, existing competitors could step up their game, or even customer preferences could shift. Investors need to think about whether the company can maintain that competitive edge over time.
And then there are those external factors that, like you said, are largely beyond their control. We're talking the global economy, currency fluctuations, geopolitical events. Those can have a big impact on a company's performance.
Especially for a company like Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd., with that heavy reliance on exports. So investors need to consider their own risk tolerance. How comfortable are they with those uncertainties?
So a lot to consider, but let's bring it back to our listeners. If someone's intrigued by Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd, what are the next steps they should take?
Go beyond what we've discussed here. Don't just take our word for it. Dig into those financial statements. Read industry reports. Follow the news and analysis. The more you know, the better equipped you'll be to make a good decision.
Absolutely. And remember, investing always involves some risk. There are no guarantees. But by doing your homework, you can make smarter choices that align with your goals and your risk tolerance.
Well said. And at the end of the day, the decision to invest or not in Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd. is a personal one. No right or wrong answer. But I hope this deep dive has given our listeners the knowledge and insights they need to make that decision with confidence.
I think it has. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and joining us on this deep dive into the world of Venus Pipes and Tubes Ltd. We've covered a lot of ground here: their financials, their strategy, the challenges they face, and the opportunities that lie ahead. It's been a whirlwind of information, but hopefully a valuable one.
It's been fascinating. It really highlights how important it is to stay curious, to stay informed. The world of business and finance, it's always changing.
It is. So keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you on our next deep dive into a whole new world of fascinating facts and figures. Until then, happy investing.